Approaches to instruction. This chapter is concerned with helping you answer two questions. What are my objectives, or what do I want students to know and be able to do after I complete a unit of instruction? And how can I help students achieve those objectives? The ordering of these two questions is not arbitrary. Instructional planning should always begin with a description of what you want students to know and be able to do some weeks or even months after the beginning of an instructional unit. If you decide in advance what you want your students to achieve, you can prepare lessons that logically lead to a particular result and also use evaluation techniques efficiently designed to determine what level of achievement has occurred. Once you have a clear idea of what you are trying to accomplish with your students, you can consider how you are going to help get them there. Here is where you can use your knowledge of learning and motivation. After all, if the goal of teaching is to help students acquire and use a variety of knowledge and skills, what better way to do that than to use approaches and techniques that are consistent with what is known about how people learn and the conditions under which they learn best. The theories that underlie the approaches to instruction described in this chapter emphasize different aspects of the learning process, and each has been supported by research. Thus, no one theory is sufficiently comprehensive and powerful that you can rely exclusively on it as a guide for designing classroom instruction. To work effectively with the diversity of students you will almost certainly encounter, you will need to use a variety of instructional approaches and techniques. For some objectives and students, you may want to use a slightly structured approach that is consistent with the principles of behavioral theory. For other objectives, you may want to emphasize cognitive approaches that focus on helping students develop more effective learning and problem-solving skills. You may also want students to work productively in groups and respond to you and to learning in positive ways and develop positive feelings about themselves as students. And you will probably also want to integrate computer-based technology with one or more of these approaches. This eclectic approach to instruction is, by the way, consistent with the concepts of teaching adaptively, which we mentioned in Chapter 1, and differentiated instruction, which we briefly discussed in Chapter 4. Lest you think that our recommendation to combine theories is an interesting but untested idea, this integrated approach has been put into practice by the staff of an alternative middle school in Rhode Island called the Urban Collaborative Accelerated Program, UCAP. The purpose of UCAP was to work with students who had been retained in a grade one or more times, and were therefore at risk of dropping out of school. The most radical and striking characteristic of UCAP is the use of 50 criteria to determine whether students should be promoted to the next grade. This approach is quite consistent with the behavioral view that complex behaviors cannot be properly learned until more basic behaviors are mastered, and that students must clearly and convincingly demonstrate those behaviors. It is also consistent with an approach to instruction and classroom assessment called mastery learning, which we will discuss in Chapter 14 on classroom assessment. Other techniques that were used and the approaches they represent included the following: having teachers play the role of coach instead of information provider through lectures, constructivist approach, humanistic approach, the use of problem and project-based learning, constructivist approach, and small group learning and peer tutoring, social approach. As of 2004, UCAP was meeting the achievement targets called for by No Child Left Behind and was classified by the state as a moderately performing and improving school. Devising and using objectives. Contrasting objectives with educational goals. One way to help you understand the nature of instructional objectives is to contrast them with something with which they are often confused: educational goals. Goals are relatively broad statements of what political and educational leaders would like to see schools accomplish. Consider, for example, the following two goal statements. Students will acquire the thinking skills that will allow them to become responsible citizens, independent learners, and productive workers. All adults will be sufficiently literate, knowledgeable, and skilled to compete in a global economy and behave as responsible citizens. Although they are ambitious and laudatory, statements of this sort do not provide very useful guidelines for teachers charged with the responsibility for achieving such goals. What exactly is meant by thinking skills or being sufficiently literate, knowledgeable, and skilled? And will these terms mean the same thing to every teacher? Thinking skills, for example, could be interpreted to mean everything from memorization to problem solving. Instructional objectives, in contrast to these broad educational goals, specify the kinds of observable and measurable student behaviors that make it possible for the underlying goals to be achieved. To give teachers both a common vocabulary and a system for writing different kinds of objectives, psychologists have created organizational schemes called taxonomies. Taxonomies of objectives. Awareness of the vagueness of educational goals stimulated a group of psychologists who specialized in testing to seek a better way to describe educational objectives. After experimenting with various ways to prepare lists of objectives that would be more useful to teachers than vaguely worded sets of goals, the test specialists decided to develop taxonomies of educational objectives. A taxonomy is a classification scheme with categories arranged in hierarchical order. Because goals of education are extremely diverse, the decision was made to prepare taxonomies in 3 areas, or domains: cognitive, affective, and psychomotor. The taxonomy for the cognitive domain stresses knowledge and intellectual skills. The taxonomy for the affective domain concentrates on attitudes and values. And the taxonomy for the psychomotor domain focuses on physical abilities and skills. Taxonomy for the cognitive domain. The first and most widely used taxonomy for the cognitive domain was prepared by Benjamin S. Bloom, Max D. Engelhardt, Edward J. First, Walker H. Hill, and David R. Krathwohl. It consists of 6 hierarchically ordered levels of instructional outcomes: knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation. The taxonomy is described as a hierarchy because it was reasoned that comprehension relies on prior mastery of knowledge or facts, that application depends on comprehension of relevant ideas, and so on through the remaining levels. An abridged outline of the taxonomy for the cognitive domain follows. Taxonomy of educational objectives, cognitive domain. Knowledge, remembering previously learned information such as facts, terms, procedures, and principles. Comprehension, grasping the meaning of information by putting it into one's own words, drawing conclusions, or stating implications. Application, applying knowledge to actual situations, as in taking principles learned in math and applying them to laying out a baseball diamond, or applying principles of civil liberties to current events. Analysis, breaking down objects or ideas into simpler parts and seeing how the parts relate and are organized. For example, discussing how the public and the private sectors differ, or detecting logical fallacies in an argument. Synthesis, rearranging component ideas into a new whole. For example, planning a panel discussion or writing a comprehensive term paper. Evaluation, making judgments based on internal evidence or external criteria. For example, evaluating a work of art, editing a term paper, or detecting inconsistencies in the speech of a politician. Although the cognitive domain taxonomy has served educators well for more than 50 years, research in the areas of cognitive psychology, curriculum and instruction, and assessment suggested to some that a change was in order. 2 alternatives now exist. The first alternative is organized as a 2-dimensional table rather than as a cumulative hierarchy. The first dimension is called the cognitive process dimension and contains mostly familiar concepts: remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. The second dimension is called the knowledge dimension and has 4 categories: factual knowledge, conceptual knowledge, procedural knowledge, and metacognitive knowledge. Each knowledge category is composed of 2 or more types. Procedural knowledge, for example, is composed of knowledge of subject-specific skills and algorithms, knowledge of subject-specific techniques and methods, and knowledge of criteria for determining when to use appropriate procedures. The objectives that flow from the revised taxonomy reflect the intersection of these two dimensions. An objective that lies at the intersection of apply and conceptual knowledge, for example, might be the student will set Vygotsky's principle of scaffolded instruction by teaching a struggling primary grade student how to multiply fractions. The second alternative to the original cognitive domain taxonomy is similar in structure to the first alternative in that it has two intersecting dimensions, but it is broader in scope. The first dimension is called levels of processing and contains 6 levels: retrieval, comprehension, analysis, knowledge utilization, metacognitive system, and self-system. The second dimension is called domains of knowledge and is composed of information, mental procedures, psychomotor procedures. The broadness of this model comes from the metacognitive and self-systems, which are assumed to reflect affective processes and psychomotor procedures. Time will tell whether either alternative proves to be as popular and useful as the original. Taxonomy for the affective domain. In addition to arranging instructional experiences to help students achieve cognitive objectives, virtually all teachers are interested in encouraging the development of attitudes and values. To clarify the nature of such objectives, a taxonomy for the affective domain was prepared, and affective objectives are more difficult to define, evaluate, or encourage than cognitive objectives because they are often demonstrated in subtle or indirect ways. Furthermore, certain aspects of value development are sometimes considered to be more the responsibility of parents than of teachers. Finally, because values and attitudes involve a significant element of personal choice, they are often expressed more clearly out of school than in the classroom. The complete taxonomy for the affective domain stresses out-of-school values as much as, if not more than, in-school values. The following abridgment concentrates on the kinds of affective objectives you are most likely to be concerned with as a teacher. You will probably recognize, though, that there is not much you can do to influence substantially the kinds of objectives described in the higher levels of the taxonomy, because they represent a crystallization of values formed by experiences over an extended period of time. Taxonomy of educational objectives, affective domain: receiving, attending, willingness to receive or attend, responding, active participation indicating positive response or acceptance of an idea or policy, valuing, expressing a belief or attitude about the value or worth of something, organization, organizing various values into an internalized system, characterization by a value or value complex. The value system becomes a way of life. Taxonomy for the psychomotor domain. Cognitive and affective objectives are important at all grade levels, but so are psychomotor objectives. Regardless of the grade level or subject you teach, at some point you are likely to want to help your students acquire physical skills of various kinds. In the primary grades, for example, you will want your students to learn how to print legibly. And in many subjects in middle school and high school, psychomotor skills, for example, driving a car, playing a violin, adjusting a microscope, manipulating a computer keyboard, operating a power saw, throwing a pot, may be essential. Recognition of the importance of physical skills prompted Elizabeth Simpson to prepare a taxonomy for the psychomotor domain. An abridged version of the taxonomy follows. Taxonomy of educational objectives, psychomotor domain. Perception, using sense organs to obtain cues needed to guide motor activity. Set, being ready to perform a particular action. Guided response, performing under the guidance of a model. Mechanism, being able to perform a task habitually with some degree of confidence and proficiency. For example, demonstrating the ability to get the first serve in the service area 70% of the time. Complex or overt response, performing a task with a high degree of proficiency and skill. For example, typing all kinds of business letters and forms quickly with no errors. Adaptation, using previously learned skills to perform new but related tasks. For example, using skills developed while using a word processor to do desktop publishing. Organization, creating new performances after having developed skills. For example, creating a new form of modern dance. Why use taxonomies? Using these taxonomies will help you avoid two common instructional failings: ignoring entire classes of outcomes, usually affective and psychomotor, and overemphasizing the lowest level of the cognitive domain. According to Benjamin S. Bloom, organizer and driving force of the team that prepared the first taxonomy, after the sale of over 1 million copies of the Taxonomy of Educational Objectives, Cognitive Domain, and over a quarter of a century of use of this domain in pre-service and in-school teacher training, in-service teachers training, it is estimated that over 90% of test questions that U.S. public school students are now expected to answer deal with little more than information. Our instructional material, our classroom teaching methods, and our testing methods rarely rise above the lowest category of the taxonomy, knowledge. The next section describes how you can write and profitably use objectives. Ways to state and use objectives. Many psychologists have offered suggestions for writing and using objectives, but the following discussion is limited to recommendations made by two of the most influential writers on the subject, Robert F. Major and Norman E. Grunland. Major's recommendations for use of specific objectives. With the publication of a provocative and unorthodox treatise titled Preparing Instructional Objectives, Major sparked considerable interest in the use of objectives. Major emphasizes the importance of objectives by pointing out that if you don't know where you're going, the best made maps won't help you get there without a way to communicate your instructional objectives to others. You wouldn't be able to decide which instructional content and procedures would help you accomplish your objectives. You wouldn't be able to create a measuring instrument that would tell you whether your students have become competent enough to move on. And your students wouldn't be able to decide for themselves when to stop practicing. Major then offers these suggestions for writing specific objectives of instruction. Describe what you want learners to be doing when demonstrating achievement, and indicate how you will know they are doing it. In your description, identify and name the behavioral act that indicates achievement, define the conditions under which the behavior is to occur, and state the criteria of acceptable performance. Write a separate objective for each learning performance. Here are some examples of the types of objectives Major recommends. Correctly solve at least 7 addition problems consisting of 3 two-digit numbers within a period of 3 minutes. Given pictures of 10 trees, correctly identify at least 8 as either deciduous or evergreen. Correctly spell at least 90% of the words on that list handed out last week. Given a computer and word processing program, set it up to type a business letter according to the specifications provided within 2 minutes. Note that the criteria of acceptable performance cannot be stated as a time limit, a minimum number of correct responses. It can be as a time limit, correct responses, or a proportion of correct responses. Major's proposals were widely endorsed immediately after the publication of Preparing Instructional Objectives, but in time it became apparent that the very specific kinds of objectives he recommended were most useful in situations in which students were asked to acquire knowledge of factual information or to learn simple skills. Grunland concluded that a different type of objective was more appropriate for more complex and advanced kinds of learning. Grunland's recommendations for use of general objectives. Grunland has developed a 2-step procedure for writing a more general type of objective. Examine what is to be learned with reference to lists of objectives, such as those included in the 3 taxonomies. Use such lists to formulate general objectives of instruction that describe types of behavior students should exhibit to demonstrate what they have learned. Under each general instructional objective, list up to 5 specific learning outcomes that provide a representative sample of what students should be able to do when they have achieved the general objective. Each learning outcome should begin with an action verb, such as explain or describe, that names the particular action the student is expected to take. To see how Grundland's method differs from Major's, imagine that you are teaching an educational psychology course and that you want to write objectives that reflect an understanding of the 4 stages of Piaget's theory of cognitive development. Figure 13.1 compares objectives you might develop using Grundland's approach with objectives that follow Major's method. Grundland gives several reasons for beginning with general objectives. First, most learning activities are too complex to be described in terms of a specific objective for every learning outcome as Major proposed. Second, the kind of specific objective Major advocated may tend to cause instructors and students to concentrate on memorizing facts and mastering simple skills. And as indicated earlier, these types of behaviors are at the lowest levels of the taxonomies of objectives. Third, specific objectives can restrict the flexibility of the teacher. Grundland's objectives allow performance criteria to be kept separate from the objective, so a teacher can revise performance standards as needed without having to rewrite the objective. This feature is useful if the same behavior is to be evaluated several times over the course of a unit of instruction, with successively higher levels of performance required. A fourth and final reason is that general objectives help keep you aware that the main target of your instructional efforts is the general outcome, such as comprehension, application, or analysis. Aligning assessment with objectives and instruction. Writing clear objectives in language that students understand and aligning those objectives with the tests you create to assess what students have learned is the first step in what we refer to in Chapter 14 as assessment for learning, as opposed to assessment of learning. As we discuss in Chapter 14, there are several types of classroom assessment methods, each of which is most useful for measuring only certain outcomes. Multiple choice, short answer, and true-false tests are useful for measuring mastery of basic factual knowledge. For objectives that emphasize the comprehension, analysis, and synthesis levels of Bloom's taxonomy, essay questions that call for students to summarize, compare, and contrast would be more useful. For objectives that reflect a constructivist orientation, paper and pencil tests are likely to be much less useful than requiring students to solve a complex problem, create a product over an extended period of time, or work productively with a small group of peers on a project. Here's a small example of how things can go wrong if you don't align your tests with both your objectives and your instructional methods. If you tell students that you want them to organize information into logical structures, integrate ideas into broad themes, and make connections with knowledge learned elsewhere, and you teach them how to think along those lines, but you load your tests with short answer and multiple choice items that require rote memorization, don't be surprised when students simply memorize facts. From their perspective, the content and level of the test items are the real objectives. One final comment about alignment. In the first paragraph of this section, we referred to the tests you create rather than the tests you use. These two terms imply a subtle but important distinction. The best way to ensure alignment of objectives, teaching approach, and assessment is for you to be the creator of the assessment. If you use a test that someone else has designed, such as a standardized test, it is almost certain that some of the items will not match your objectives or instructional approach. Evaluations of the effectiveness of objectives. Do students learn more when their teachers provide them with clearly written objectives? The answer is yes, but only under certain conditions. Although most of the research on the effectiveness of objectives was conducted over 30 years ago, the major conclusions drawn from it are as valid today as they were then. Objectives seem to work best when students are aware of them, treat them as directions to learn specific sections of material, and feel they will aid learning, Objectives seem to work best when they are clearly written and the learning task is neither too difficult nor too easy. Students of average ability seem to profit more from being given objectives than do students of higher or lower ability. Objectives lead to an improvement in intentional learning, what is stressed as important, but to a decline in incidental learning, not emphasized by the teacher. General objectives of the type that Grunland recommended seem to lead to more incidental learning than do specific objectives of the type that Major recommended. As we mentioned at the beginning of the chapter, once you have decided what it is you want your students to learn, you need to decide which approaches you will use to help them achieve those objectives. Our use of the term approaches is deliberate. To repeat what we said at the beginning of the chapter, different approaches to instruction are based on different theories of learning and motivation. And given the complexity of the learning process and the diversity of learners in most classrooms, no one theory can be used for all instructional purposes and for all students. So as you read through the next several sections, try to imagine how you might use each approach over the course of a school year.